I think back to in 2012 when I accepted Jesus and when I was saved.
Mm-hmm.
I was I was on the rocky ground, I feel like. I was like, hey, yeah, Jesus, let's listen to K-Love, Air One, you know?
Sure.
Yeah. Started volunteering in kids ministry and everything was great and good, and then it wasn't. Like there were so many areas in my life where I was just acting a fool, and when stuff started collapsing around me, I was like, well, this Christianity thing isn't what it was made out to be.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to Bros Who Bible, the podcast that brings the truth of the Bible to life. Our episodes drop every Wednesday, so be sure to like and subscribe. Jesus one time told a parable called the parable of the sower, probably his most famous parable. He said, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depths of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil, and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. That's the parable of the sower. Sean, what do you think about that?
I think let's garden. Let's go. we've gardened before on this show, so let's do it again.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of agricultural metaphors and like stories in the Bible for sure.
When I say that jokingly, but I think like the first time I read this, I'm like, okay, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And Jesus does explain it later, but I mean, as a brief summary of what Jesus is saying is there's somebody who sows the word. So he sows scripture, sows the good news about Jesus, and it falls on one of four different types of soil. It can fall either on the path, which is hard soil. It can fall on rocky soil, which doesn't have a lot of depth. It can fall among thorns, which can ultimately choke out whatever grain is produced. And then good soil that actually produces an abundant crop. And that's how Jesus describes how his message, his word, falls and lands, you could say, on different people.
Yeah. And I think if I look at my life, I think I've been all four types of soil.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and sometimes I can flip-flop back and forth, and there's certain things that I feel like I'm soil number 4, like the good soil, right? Whereas other areas of my life, I might be soil number 3.
Yeah,
on
thorns.
In the thorns. Yeah, so I think back to in 2012 when I accepted Jesus and when I was saved. I was I was on the rocky ground, I feel like. I was like, hey, yeah, Jesus, let's listen to K-Love, Air One, you know?
Sure.
Yeah. Started volunteering in kids ministry and everything was great and good, and then it wasn't. Like there were so many areas in my life where I was just acting a fool, and when stuff started collapsing around me, I was like, well, this Christianity thing isn't what it was made out to be.
Totally. Yeah. You think you thought, hey, maybe it's the seed or the word that's failed.
Yeah. Well, I thought, well, God's Superman, so he could just swing in with his cape and just save me from all of this. But I continued to do things that were adding gasoline to that fire that was burning. So why would he come in and save me from that?
Right.
When I'm not willing to save myself. So the next several years of my life were rocky. I went through, my alcoholism and drug addiction kind of took over during that time. I completely let God out of my life. Like I think I still accepted Jesus at that point, like deep down. But I think at that point, like I might as well have been the seed that was sown on the path because it just wasn't there. I wasn't actively pursuing it.
Yeah, when Jesus describes the sown on the path, he says that ground, the evil one comes away and snatches away what's been sown in a person's heart. Yeah. But then you said rocky soil.
Yeah.
Jesus said the rocky one is the one that receives it immediately with joy, receives God's message with joy, but it doesn't have root in itself. It endures for a little while. But when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately it falls away.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have a depth of soil. It gets scorched. Yep.
Yeah.
And then you had also mentioned thorns. Talk about the thorns.
Yeah, so the thorns I feel like came into play probably about 3 years ago. And there's still some thorny soil that I'm dealing with today. But I think within this thorny soil, you can get a good root, but there's weeds in there, and there's a lot that can choke the seed, right? So even though like there's fruit growing, it can kind of get lost and tangled in all this other minutia, all this other junk that's going on.
Yep.
But what I think, like if you think about gardening, and this is why Jesus spoke in parables, is because it could be very relatable, because a lot of people were farming back then, and they understood, okay, well, with this kind of soil, you can go in and you can work it. You can remove some of the weeds. You can be really particular on how you fertilize it. And that soil can eventually turn into good soil. But you have to take the action steps in order to make it happen.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a lot of areas in my life where I've trusted God completely with right? Like since becoming sober, I've given that to God.
Totally.
I don't have any anxiety over it. I don't have
any temptations.
No temptations.
Really?
And
Wow.
really like no
praise
shame
God.
or
That's
guilt
awesome.
around that and the way I acted back then. There's some stuff that can come up every now and then. I was like, oh man, I did that. But it's like, yeah, I did that. And I'm not doing that anymore. Yeah. So I think with that, like I've given that to God. That's some good soil growing right there.
Yeah.
And it continues to multiply. And but then there's other parts of my life where I'm just like, I got this. A lot of it's like with relationships. You know? Yeah. Dating game.
Well,
like.
that's what Jesus talks about when he talks about the cares of the world. He's talking about the thorns. He says things that can choke out his message.
Yeah.
Are the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches. That those things have the potential to actually choke out any good fruit that could come from his word in a person's life.
I'll give you a great example. A few weeks, months ago or whatever, I was out with somebody, and she had a Catholic background, but wasn't actively pursuing Christianity. We were sitting there talking, and I was telling her how important my faith was. But in this conversation, we started, we'd made a couple jokes here and there, and she had made a joke about like something about Jesus, and I forget the joke, and it was somewhat of a harmless joke. And I kind of chuckled at it, but like in my mind immediately I was like, man, like, am I actually like turning away from my beliefs right now and like my belief system just to appease this conversation with this person right now, and why? And that's where I felt some like, okay, well, this is exactly what he's talking about with thorny soil.
Totally. Yeah.
Like I was willing to go
cares of the world.
Yeah, I was willing to
Caring
go back on how I feel just for that. So work to do. But I feel like, the ability to recognize that and work on it, admit fault, ask for forgiveness, pray about it, can set you right back on that path. And that's weeding.
That's weeding, yeah. Yeah, and the sower is the one who not only does he sow the seed, which is his message, is Jesus, right? Jesus sowing his message. But he's also the one that cares for the soil. And based on, our response to Jesus, whether we turn back to him and trust him with our life, he's going to go to work and start removing weeds, start turning that rocky soil and, laying topsoil over the top of it and removing the larger rocks and, agricultural illustrations can go on. But he's basically, based on whether you turn to him or not, he's going to change your heart and actually start to bear fruit in your life, which can be good, right? It can actually lead to our flourishing, and we can actually live in the relationship with God that he intended for. I remember the first time I heard this parable, because I became a Christian just a couple years before you did. This was in 2009, and I was sitting in a church service, and I can't remember all the particulars of the sermon, but this was preached, and I remember thinking that exact same thing about the thorns and thinking, oh, that's totally me.
Yeah.
And it scared me. It frightened me to a point to say, oh, if I'm that, then if I'm rocky or thorny soil, then what does that mean for the rest of my life and then my relationship with God after I die into eternity? And I was really struck by that. So much so that it actually drew me in to wanting to learn more about Jesus. So what I probably felt as fear and terror was actually conviction. God was actually convicting me to say, hey, you're not really following me. And I want you to follow me. So God can sometimes use teachings like this in order to draw us back to him so he can go working on our hearts and changing our soil.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Jesus actually talks about the purpose of the parables in this section. So this is Matthew 13, which we just read from, where Jesus actually gives the parable of the sower, but then he gives the purpose of them. And he said, "This is why I speak in parables, because some, seeing, do not see, and hearing, they do not hear, nor do they understand." And then he goes on to say that some, though, are blessed, and they have eyes to see, and they have ears to hear, and they hear, so that they can understand, and they do turn, and they are healed. So he's saying, hey, my parables, depending on the type of person you are, they're going to have one of two effects. I've heard somebody explain it this way, that there are some who respond like clay and some who respond like chocolate. Well, the sun does the same thing. The sun just shines, right?
Yeah.
But it will either harden the clay, your heart, or it will soften it, and you will respond. And that's what these parables do, is that they either draw you into a relationship with Jesus because he wants to give you his love. He wants to forgive you.
Yeah, yeah.
And you'll melt, kind of like the conviction that
so
I felt. Or
parables where he's calling out the Pharisees.
Yeah,
the
that's
Pharisees,
right.
Like,
and it just hardens them.
And it says they knew they were talking about them. So
And they're like,
they figured
we got to kill this guy.
Yeah. They
Right?
retreated to find a way to kill him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that highlights something too. It's nobody's neutral. Nobody's like in the middle. Nobody's like, oh, well, I'm not clay, I'm not chocolate. No, you're one of them, one or the other. And when you hear Jesus' message, it will either harden you further or it'll soften you. And, to anybody listening to this, you can be softened. All you have to do is ask God. Ask God to soften your heart, to receive his message. And he'll do that work in your heart. He'll do that work in your life. And he'll transform your life and change you to the point where, like Jesus says, you will bear fruit and yield in one case 100-fold, another 60, and another 30.
Yeah.
That's spiritual, eternal fruit. That comes as a relationship of receiving God's message, believing in it, trusting in it, and then putting it into practice in your life.
Well, what a great way to. I notice like the difference, like on some mornings when I'm reading my Bible and I'm feeling a little rushed or I'm cluttered or my mind is going everywhere.
Yeah,
happens a lot. I don't take the time to pray before I read the Bible, and it's harder to comprehend. I find myself like reading a whole paragraph. And I'm like, what did I just read? I go back and reread it. I'm like, I missed all of this.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But then there's those times where I'm very intentional. I take the time to pray beforehand. Like, God, there's wisdom in here that you want me to hear. Speak to me and tell me, like, add emphasis to whatever you need in order to stir up my heart and help me understand this. And when I do that, it hits me so much differently.
Yeah, totally.
And so there's wisdom to that. Is like, hey, if there's something that you feel is going on in your life, or that you feel you're not about, you have that conviction, right? Or maybe you're feeling some guilt or scared. Pray about that and then read about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember when I first became a Christian, what I had done is I had betrayed one of my friends, and I couldn't sleep that night. I felt like there was an elephant sitting on my chest. That was the first time I really prayed to God and asked God, I just know I'm not doing something right. And I don't even really know if you exist, but if you do, will you just change my life? And I didn't become a Christian like on the spot right there. In fact, I didn't become a Christian until a couple years after that. But I can look back at that and say, I saw how God was then aligning the pieces of my life to change my life and ultimately make me his own. And now I'd say
you allowed him to be the sower.
Yeah, allowed him to be the sower.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Any other last takeaways from this parable that stand out to you? This is one of Jesus' most famous teachings.
One last thing I do want to talk about is, Jesus also in the Great Commission says, go out and
make disciples.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, like, as you progress in your sowership,
sure. Yeah.
your soilship here.
Yeah.
What responsibility do you carry to help somebody else or help disciple somebody else? Like, if you're the path soil, right? And I'm on this good soil, but you have some interest, right? Like maybe there's some interest there.
Totally.
What responsibility do I have to kind of take you alongside of me and help you curate better soil?
Yeah, Peter talks about it in one of his letters where he said, always be prepared to give a defense of the hope that you have within you. So what he's saying to, who he was writing to, and he was writing to churches, we could say he was writing to us. I think that's applicable to exactly what you're saying, is that we should always be ready to invest in and share the word, the message of Jesus with people, and always be prepared to do that. And he talks about doing so with gentleness and respect, right? So I think that's a responsibility of all Christians to be able to, hey, if there's good news, then share it.
Yeah.
Share it with people. Tell people about who Jesus is, because ultimately Jesus is drawing people to himself, and we should have confidence in that. And we shouldn't just assume, oh, that person, he's totally rocky soil, so my message is just fall on deaf ears there. Oh, and there's some thorny guy over there.
Yeah, I don't want to waste the energy there.
Yeah, all that is just judging people, right? We're trying to judge somebody's spiritual state.
Yeah. Then is your soil really good? At that point?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. That should force you to think, what kind of soil am I?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That's a good question, though. Yeah, because people are in all different places, but we just trust, hey, God's working on people, and he wants his word to be shared.
Well, and how do you do that? I mean, obviously you're a pastor, so you come up with that a lot. Like, people come up to you and like, Daniel, I'm struggling with my faith. To me, I take that as, well, I can just be really open with my testimony and how Jesus has worked in my life.
Yeah.
Not preach at him.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a preacher, but I can
Sure.
say, hey, this is where I was messing up. This is where I gave it to God, and this is what I've seen as a result.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be as simple as, telling your neighbors that, oh, sorry, I can't do that on Sunday. We actually go to church, right? And that could just start a conversation with somebody.
Oh, where do you go to church?
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, there you go. And then, other things could be when you hear comments of like, hey, yeah, I noticed your kids, like, I noticed that they sit really well at a dinner table. And you say, well, yeah, they have to sit in church with us. So I think that kind of, has taught them. And yeah, because I'm a pastor, it's actually kind of hard for me to put myself in another person's skin, because usually it's just somebody says, what do you do? Because that's probably the second question people ask you after what's your name.
Yeah.
And then when I tell them I'm a pastor, it naturally leads to a question of, yeah, have you ever been to church? Or, yeah, do you believe in God? What are your thoughts? And then it just creates a natural conversation. Yeah. But for others, how I would instruct them is just say, hey, just be ready. Not every conversation do you have to insert Jesus into the conversation, but I think you'd be surprised at how many opportunities that we do have.
Oh, yeah.
And just capitalizing
getting out
on
of your
those.
own way and being confident and secure enough in your foundation and your faith to do that.
Totally.
Because I did it for a long time.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here broing and Bibling with you.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't have it locked in. I mean, there's times where I'll be getting a haircut, and people ask me what I do, and I say I'm a pastor, and it's awkward. I'm thinking, I just want to get a haircut. I don't really want to talk about God.
Yeah. That's how I feel about when somebody asks me about the market.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
1,100 other things I would rather talk about the market.
How is the market right now?
Good market.
Good market.
Yeah.
Well, that's the parable of the sower, and I think that probably does it for this episode of Bros Who Bible.
Yeah, thanks for listening, and make sure you hit the like and subscribe, and check back every Wednesday as we drop new episodes. We're out.
Later.
Cool. One down. Hey, thank you for listening to Bros Who Bible, the podcast that brings the truth of the Bible to life. Make sure you like and subscribe, and check back every Wednesday as we drop new episodes.